ridge had earned its nickname long before Task Force Viper ever set foot on its jagged spine. Local Afghan fighters called it Shaitan's Poshti, the devil's backbone, a cruel formation of limestone and shale that jutted from the Hindu Kush mountains like the fossilized remains of some primordial beast. For 3 days, the 8-man SEAL team had been pinned down on its eastern slope, their original 48-hour reconnaissance mission having devolved into a desperate fight for survival against an enemy that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Morrison pressed his face against the cold stone, feeling the vibrations of incoming mortars through the mountain itself. The Taliban had been probing their position since dawn, testing the Americans' defenses with increasingly bold advances up the treacherous terrain. What had started as a small patrol of insurgents had grown into what intelligence now estimated as a full company, nearly 100 fighters who had seemingly materialized from the very rocks themselves. "Reaper, we've got movement on the north face," whispered Petty Officer First Class Maria Santos, her voice barely audible over the team's comm system. Santos, call sign Ghost, was their designated marksman, and her position behind a cluster of weathered boulders gave her the best vantage point of their shrinking perimeter. Through her scope, she could see the telltale signs of an organized assault building. Fighters moving with purpose, weapons being positioned, the careful choreography of men who had fought in these mountains for generations. The team had been inserted via helicopter 3 nights earlier, tasked with confirming intelligence reports of a high-value target operating from a compound in the valley below. What they had found instead was a hornet's nest of Taliban activity, with the compound serving as a staging area for what appeared to be a major offensive against coalition forces in the region. The mission parameters had changed immediately, from reconnaissance to direct action, but before they could call in the strike package, the enemy had detected their presence. Now, ammunition was running critically low. Chief Petty Officer David Tank Rodriguez, the team's heavy weapons specialist, had been rationing his machine gun bursts since the second day, reducing his rate of fire to carefully aimed single shots that made each round count. The psychological effect was devastating. The enemy could sense the Americans' weakening fire, and their attacks were becoming bolder, more coordinated, more desperate. Morrison checked his watch. 13:47 hours. The extraction window wasn't for another 6 hours, and that was assuming the landing zone remained secure. The Taliban had already demonstrated their ability to position fighters throughout the valley, and Morrison knew that any helicopter attempting to reach them would face a gauntlet of rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine gun fire. The ridge itself was a tactical nightmare, too steep for vehicles, too exposed for effective cover, and honeycombed with caves that allowed the enemy to appear and disappear like ghosts. The SEALs had chosen their position well initially, a cluster of large boulders near the ridge's summit that provided 360-degree fields of fire, but what had seemed like an advantage was now becoming a death trap. They controlled the high ground, but they were also completely surrounded with nowhere to run and limited options for calling in effective close air support due to the extreme terrain. Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Wizard Kim, their communications specialist, had been working frantically to maintain contact with their command center at Bagram Air Base. The mountains played havoc with radio signals, and the team's satellite communication system had taken shrapnel damage during the first enemy probe. Kim had managed to jury-rig a solution using spare batteries and antenna wire, but their connection remained sporadic at best. "Reaper, I'm getting intermittent contact with Chaos Main," Kim reported, using the call sign for their Tactical Operations Center. "They're tracking our situation, but close air support is still 30 minutes out. Weather's moving in from the west. Visibility's going to be near zero soon." Morrison cursed under his breath. The weather had been their enemy almost as much as the Taliban. A massive storm system was rolling in from the Afghan-Pakistani border, bringing with it the kind of cloud cover and precipitation that would ground most aircraft and make targeting nearly impossible for those brave enough to fly. If they didn't get air support soon, they would be on their own until the weather cleared, potentially days. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Sarah Doc Williams was tending to Petty Officer 3rd Class Mike Joker Patterson, who had taken shrapnel to his left shoulder during the previous evening's attack. Patterson, despite his injury, had refused evacuation and continued to operate his squad automatic weapon with deadly precision. Doc had done what she could with their limited medical supplies, but Patterson was losing blood steadily, and his effectiveness was declining with each passing hour. The team's sniper, Petty Officer 2nd Class Alex Longshot Chen, had been their most effective weapon against the Taliban advance. Positioned in a natural depression about 50 meters upslope from the main defensive position, Chen had been methodically eliminating enemy leaders and heavy weapons crews. His M110 semi-automatic sniper system had accounted for at least 15 confirmed kills, but the enemy was adapting, using smoke and coordinated movement to limit his effectiveness. As the afternoon wore on, the attacks intensified. The Taliban had brought up what sounded like a recoilless rifle, a weapon capable of destroying their boulder fortress with a single, well-placed shot. The first round had impacted 20 meters to their south, showering the position with stone fragments and demonstrating the enemy's improving accuracy. Morrison knew that the next shot would likely find its mark. The psychological pressure was enormous. These weren't the typical Taliban fighters the team had faced in previous operations. These were hardened veterans who moved with the confidence of men fighting on their home ground. They knew every rock, every depression, every possible avenue of approach and escape. They were patient, methodical, and seemingly inexhaustible in their numbers. Santos adjusted her position slightly, her rifle tracking a group of fighters attempting to flank their position from the northeast. The enemy had learned to respect her marksmanship, but they were also learning her patterns, forcing her to constantly reposition to avoid counter-sniper fire. Through her scope, she could see more fighters moving up the valley. This wasn't just an opportunistic attack, but a deliberate operation to eliminate the American team. The wind began to pick up as the first clouds rolled over the ridgeline, bringing with them the promise of the approaching storm. Morrison made a decision that would either save his team or doom them all. They needed to break the enemy's momentum before the weather grounded all air support and left them completely isolated on the Devil's backbone. "All stations, this is Reaper," Morrison transmitted on the team frequency. "We're going to initiate a fighting withdrawal to grid November 7-4 Bravo. Longshot, I need you to provide overwatch. Ghost, you and I will bound back first, then provide cover for the others. Tank, give us everything you've got left. Make them think twice about following." The plan was desperate, but it was their only chance. They would attempt to move to a secondary position further along the ridge, a location that offered better defensive advantages but required crossing nearly 200 meters of exposed ground. It was a gamble that would require perfect timing, unwavering courage, and more than a little luck. As Rodriguez prepared to unleash his remaining ammunition in one final, devastating burst, the team could hear the approaching thunder of the storm, mixing with the sound of enemy mortars. Time was running out, and the Devil's backbone was about to claim another group of warriors who had dared to challenge its dominion over the Hindu Kush Mountains. The first rounds from Rodriguez's M240 machine gun tore through the advancing Taliban fighters like a scythe through wheat, the sustained burst creating a momentary lull in the enemy advance. Morrison and Santos used the precious seconds to bound backward toward their fallback position, their boots slipping on loose shale as they navigated the treacherous terrain. But as they reached what should have been their secondary defensive position, Morrison's blood turned to ice. The rocky outcrop they had identified as their salvation was already occupied, not by Taliban fighters but by the unmistakable silhouette of American equipment. Through his rifle scope, Morrison could make out the distinctive shape of an ANPRC-117G radio, the same model their own team carried. Beside it, partially concealed by a camouflage tarp, was a Barrett M82A1 50 caliber sniper rifle, a weapon that no Taliban unit in this region should possess. "Ghost, hold position," Morrison whispered urgently into his comm. "We've got a problem." Santos, crouched behind a wind-carved stone formation, adjusted her scope and followed Morrison's line of sight. What she saw made her stomach drop. The position wasn't just occupied by enemy forces, it was occupied by what appeared to be Western operators. Through the swirling dust and heat shimmer, she could make out at least 3 figures wearing what looked like modified American combat uniforms, their faces concealed by balaclavas and tactical sunglasses. The terrible realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. They had been set up. The intelligence that had sent them to this god-forsaken ridge hadn't been about a Taliban compound. It had been bait in a trap designed to eliminate Task Force Viper entirely. Someone with access to their operational planning had orchestrated this ambush, using a rogue American unit as the hammer and the Taliban as the anvil. "Wizard, get me Chaos Main right now," Morrison barked into his comm, his voice barely controlled. "Priority Alpha transmission. We have compromise. Repeat, we have compromise." Kim's response came back filled with static and strain. "Reaper, comms are being jammed across multiple frequencies. Someone's running sophisticated electronic warfare against us. Military-grade stuff, not the usual Taliban gear." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrifying clarity. The Taliban attack had been too coordinated, too well-equipped, too perfectly timed. The enemy had known their exact insertion point, their planned route, even their fallback positions. But more disturbing was the realization that the mysterious Americans on the ridge weren't there to rescue them. They were there to ensure that none of Task Force Viper left the Devil's Backbone alive. From his overwatch position, Chen's voice crackled through the comm system with urgent intelligence. "Reaper, I've got eyes on the American position. 3 military-age males. 1 appears to be directing Taliban movement through hand signals. They're coordinating the attack against us." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. These weren't just enemy combatants. These were Americans, possibly former military, who had gone rogue and were now actively hunting their own countrymen. Morrison's mind raced through the implications. Someone high up in the command structure had to be involved, someone with access to their mission parameters and the authority to position assets in the field. Doc Williams, still treating Patterson's worsening condition, looked up with confusion and growing alarm. "Reaper, what's happening? Joker's asking why we're not moving to the secondary position." Morrison couldn't bring himself to explain the full horror of their situation over the open comm channel. If their communications were compromised, every word they spoke was being monitored by their enemies, both the Taliban and the rogue Americans who had orchestrated this elaborate death trap. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with the first drops of rain beginning to fall and visibility decreasing by the minute. But instead of hindering their enemies, the approaching storm seemed to be part of the plan. In the chaos of reduced visibility and electronic jamming, the massacre of an entire SEAL team could be attributed to a Taliban ambush, with no witnesses left alive to tell the real story. Rodriguez had finished his suppressing fire and was preparing to move when the distinctive crack of a .50 caliber rifle echoed across the ridge. The round impacted just meters from his position, sending razor-sharp stone fragments in all directions. Someone with intimate knowledge of American tactics was using their own weapons against them, turning their retreat route into a killing field. "Tank, stay where you are," Morrison ordered. "We're surrounded by friendlies gone bad. Do not, repeat, do not move toward the secondary position." The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating. Every SEAL was trained to trust their team, their command structure, and their intelligence. To discover that they had been deliberately sent into a trap by their own people shattered the fundamental assumptions that held their world together. They were now fighting not just for their lives but against a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of their own organization. Santos, fighting to control her emotions, adjusted her rifle toward the American position. Through her scope, she could see one of the figures clearly now, a tall man with the bearing and equipment of a special operations veteran. He was speaking into a radio while pointing toward the SEAL team's position, clearly coordinating the Taliban assault with the precision of someone who understood American tactics intimately. The moral complexity of their situation was staggering. These weren't foreign enemies they could engage without hesitation. These were Americans, possibly former brothers-in-arms who had chosen betrayal over loyalty. The rules of engagement became murky when the enemy wore familiar uniforms and carried familiar weapons. Chen, from his sniper position, provided crucial intelligence. "I can see vehicle movement in the valley. Looks like additional Taliban forces moving up the access road. Estimated 30 to 40 fighters, plus what appears to be a technical with a mounted heavy machine gun." The trap was closing with methodical precision. The rogue Americans had orchestrated not just an ambush, but a complete annihilation. The EBOD approaching reinforcements would seal off any possibility of escape, while the weather would prevent any rescue attempt. In a few hours, Task Force Viper would simply disappear, another casualty of the Afghan war with no one left to tell the real story. Morrison's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission, not from his team, but from an unknown caller using their frequency. The voice was American, cultured, with the flat accent of the upper Midwest. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, this is Colonel Hayes. I believe you're beginning to understand your situation." The name hit Morrison like a sledgehammer. Colonel Jonathan. Hayes was their task force commander, the man who had personally briefed them on this mission just 5 days earlier. If Hayes was involved in the conspiracy, then the corruption went all the way to the top of their operational command. "Hayes, you treacherous bastard," Morrison replied, abandoning any pretense of military courtesy. "How many pieces of silver? Did they pay you?" Hayes's laugh was cold and bitter. "This isn't about money, Commander. This is about cleaning up loose ends. Your team has seen too much, learned too much about operations that were never supposed to exist. Sometimes good soldiers have to die to protect the bigger picture." The transmission was being broadcast on their team frequency, ensuring that every member of Task Force Viper understood the scope of the betrayal. They weren't just fighting Taliban insurgents. They were fighting a rogue element within their own military that was willing to sacrifice an entire SEAL team to protect whatever illegal operations they were running in the region. As the rain began to fall harder and the clouds closed in around the Devil's Backbone, Morrison realized that their fight for survival had become something much larger, a battle against corruption and betrayal that threatened the very foundations of everything they had sworn to protect. The mountain that had earned its name from the bones of countless warriors was about to test whether 8 American SEALs could overcome not just enemy bullets, but the treachery of their own commanders. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere, at once, a deep, throaty growl that seemed to emanate from the storm clouds themselves. At first, Morrison thought it was thunder, but the sustained mechanical nature of the noise sent a different kind of electricity through his veins. Every American service member who had served in combat zones knew that sound. The distinctive whine of twin General Electric TF-34 GE-100A turbofan engines pushing an A-10 Thunderbolt II through hostile skies. "Holy shit," Rodriguez whispered from his position, momentarily forgetting radio protocol. "Is that a Warthog?" The aircraft emerged from the cloud cover like an avenging angel, flying so low that Morrison could see the pilot's helmet through the cockpit canopy. The A-10 was painted in the standard gray camouflage scheme, but there was something different about this particular aircraft. No squadron markings, no tail numbers, just the distinctive silhouette of the most feared close air support platform in the American arsenal. What made the moment even more surreal was that the A-10 wasn't supposed to be there. Morrison knew the air tasking order by heart. No fixed-wing aircraft were scheduled for their operational area, and the approaching storm should have grounded everything except the most essential flights. Yet, here was a Warthog, flying in. Conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots, apparently drawn to their position by some miracle of timing and navigation. The pilot's voice crackled over the emergency frequency, calm and professional despite the chaos. Viper. Actual, this is Hog 27. I'm showing friendly forces at your location, taking effective fire from multiple positions. Request immediate authentication and target designation. Morrison's heart pounded as he realized this might be their salvation, or another element of the trap. How could he trust anyone at this point? But as Taliban rounds began impacting closer to their position, and with the rogue Americans still coordinating the assault, he had to make a decision that could either save his team or doom them all. Hog 27. This is Viper Actual. Morrison. Transmitted, using their authentication codes. We are 8 friendlies in a world of hurt. Be advised, we have confirmed American personnel coordinating with hostile forces at grid November 7-4 Bravo. Repeat, American personnel are directing enemy fire against U.S. forces. There was a long pause before the A-10 pilot responded, and Morrison could hear the confusion and anger in the aviator's voice. Viper Actual, say again your last transmission. Did you say American personnel are engaging friendlies? That's affirmative, Hog. We've been set up by our own command structure. Colonel Hayes, our task force commander, is running a cleanup operation. We're the loose ends being tied up. The A-10 banked sharply to the left, the pilot clearly processing this information while maintaining his attack profile. Through the rain and clouds, Morrison could see the aircraft's distinctive straight wings and twin engines, built around the massive GAU-8A Avenger 30mm rotary cannon that had earned the Warthog its fearsome reputation. What Morrison couldn't know was that Captain Sarah Reaper Mitchell, the A-10 pilot circling overhead, was herself part of a classified unit that operated outside normal command channels. 3 months earlier, she had been approached by a small group of military intelligence officers who suspected widespread corruption in Special Operations Command structures. They had recruited her into an unofficial network of pilots, intelligence, analysts, and field operatives who were quietly investigating and countering rogue American military units operating in various theaters. Viper Actual, I need you to mark the American position with your infrared designator, Mitchell transmitted, her voice taking on a harder edge. I've been hunting these bastards for months. The revelation that their rescuer was part of a counter-conspiracy added another layer of complexity to their situation. Santos, following Morrison's instructions, aimed her rifle's infrared laser at the position where they had identified the rogue Americans. Through the A-10's advanced targeting systems, Mitchell could see the laser designation clearly, even in the deteriorating weather conditions. I have your mark, Mitchell confirmed. Be advised, I'm tracking at least 15 Taliban positions surrounding your location, plus the 3 American signatures you've designated. This is going to get loud. The first strafing run came without warning, the A-10's cannon unleashing a stream of 30mm depleted uranium rounds that struck the Taliban positions with devastating effect. The sound was indescribable, a buzzing roar like the world's largest chainsaw mixed with continuous thunder. Each round was the size of a milk bottle, capable of penetrating armored vehicles, and when they struck the rocky positions where Taliban fighters were sheltering, the results were catastrophic. But Mitchell wasn't just providing close air support. She was executing a carefully planned operation to eliminate the rogue American unit that had been operating in the region. For months, her intelligence network had identified Colonel Hayes as part of a conspiracy involving illegal arms sales, drug trafficking, and the elimination of anyone who might expose their operations. The Taliban, caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of American air power, began to break and run. But the 3 rogue Americans at the secondary position were made of sterner stuff. Through her targeting pod, Mitchell could see them attempting to coordinate a withdrawal, using their knowledge of American tactics to anticipate her attack patterns. Viper Actual, the American personnel are attempting to exfiltrate north toward the Valley Road, Mitchell reported. I'm going to cut them off, but I need you to be ready to move. This weather window won't last long. Chen, from his overwatch position, had a clear view of the dramatic chase developing below. The rogue Americans were moving with professional skill, using the terrain to mask their movement while maintaining communication with their Taliban allies. But they were being hunted by one of the most lethal close air support platforms ever built, piloted by someone who understood their tactics intimately. The second strafing run targeted the fleeing Americans directly, Mitchell's cannon rounds, walking across the rocky ground in a line of destruction that forced the rogue operators to take cover. But instead of eliminating them, she was herding them toward a specific location, a narrow ravine where they would have no choice but to stand and fight. "All Viper elements, this is Hog 2-7, Mitchell transmitted, her voice carrying an edge of grim satisfaction. "I'm going to force these guys into the open. When I do, I need positive identification on each target. We need at least one alive for interrogation." The psychological impact on the SEAL team was profound. After hours of feeling abandoned and betrayed, they now had not just air support, but a pilot who understood the larger conspiracy and was actively working to expose it. The revelation that there were others in the military fighting against the corruption gave them hope that their sacrifice might not be in vain. Patterson, despite his worsening shoulder wound, managed to prop himself up with his squad automatic weapon. "Doc, patch me up good enough to fight," he said through gritted teeth. "I want a piece of these traitors." Williams worked quickly to stabilize Patterson's wound, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. The A-10 was providing them with a tactical advantage, but they were still outnumbered and fighting in treacherous terrain against enemies who knew the ground intimately. The third strafing run was different. Instead of the devastating cannon fire, Mitchell deployed flares and smoke rounds, creating a wall of concealment that allowed the SEAL team to begin moving toward a more defensible position. But she was also using the pyrotechnics to flush out the remaining Taliban fighters, forcing them into the open where her cannon could eliminate them with surgical precision. Rodriguez, moving under the cover of Mitchell's smoke screen, found himself face to face with a Taliban fighter who had been separated from his unit. The brief firefight was vicious and personal, fought at a range measured in meters rather than hundreds of yards. When it was over, Rodriguez had captured not just the Taliban fighter's weapon, but also a sophisticated radio system that clearly had American origins. "Reaper, you need to see this," Rodriguez called out, holding up the radio. "This isn't Chinese knockoff gear. This is current-issue American military communications equipment." The evidence was mounting that the conspiracy reached far beyond just Colonel Hayes and his immediate accomplices. The Taliban fighters weren't just being coordinated by rogue Americans, they were being equipped with current American military technology, suggesting a supply line that reached into the highest levels of the defense establishment. Mitchell's voice crackled over the comm system with urgency. "Viper! Actual, I'm tracking multiple vehicle signatures moving up the Valley Road. Looks like reinforcements, and they're moving fast. I can give you maybe 10 more minutes before this position becomes completely untenable." The A-10 had bought them precious time and eliminated many of their immediate threats, but the larger battle was far from over. They still had to survive long enough to get their evidence to someone they could trust, and with Colonel Hayes controlling their normal command channels, that meant finding an entirely different way to communicate their discoveries to the outside world. As Mitchell prepared for another attack run against the approaching vehicles, Morrison realized that their fight on the Devil's Backbone had evolved into something much larger than a simple survival mission. It had become a battle for the soul of the American military itself. The final confrontation came not with the thunderous roar of Mitchell's cannon, but with an eerie silence that settled over the Devil's Backbone like a burial shroud. The approaching Taliban reinforcements had mysteriously halted their advance, their vehicles forming a defensive perimeter in the valley below rather than pressing their attack. Through the swirling mist and rain, Morrison could see why. A convoy of American Humvees was approaching from the opposite direction, their headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of predatory beasts. "Viper Actual, this is Hog 2-7. Mitchell's voice carried a note of grim understanding. "I'm tracking what appears to be a significant American force moving up from Grid Hotel 92. This is either your rescue or the cleanup crew." Morrison felt his blood turn to ice. The timing was too convenient, the formation too precise. These weren't rescue forces responding to their distress calls. They were the final piece of Colonel Hayes's elaborate trap, arriving to eliminate both the SEAL team and any inconvenient evidence of the conspiracy. The Taliban reinforcements weren't there to finish the job. They were there to serve as witnesses to what would officially be recorded as a tragic friendly fire incident during a confused nighttime engagement. Santos, peering through her rifle scope at the approaching convoy, made a discovery that chilled her to the bone. "Reaper, the lead vehicle is flying a Task Force Viper pennant. That's our own unit insignia." The psychological warfare was as devastating as any physical attack. Hayes had dispatched what appeared to be their own rescue force, complete, with familiar unit markings and radio procedures, to ensure that the SEAL team would lower their guard before the final betrayal. The approaching soldiers would be men who knew their names, their families, their service records, and who had been ordered to kill them all in the name of operational security. Chen, from his sniper position, provided crucial intelligence that revealed the full scope of the deception. "I've got clear sight lines on the convoy. Those aren't standard-issue weapons they're carrying. I'm seeing suppressed rifles, non-standard optics, and what looks like body armor without unit patches. These guys are equipped for assassination work, not rescue operations." The realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. Not only had Hayes orchestrated their ambush, but he had assembled a dedicated hit squad from within their own special operations community. These would be shooters who understood SEAL tactics intimately, who could anticipate their every move, and who possessed the skill and equipment necessary to make their deaths look like the unfortunate result of a chaotic battlefield engagement. Mitchell's A-10 circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, her targeting systems painting laser designators on both the Taliban positions and the approaching American convoy. But her situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Her fuel was running low, her ammunition was nearly expended, and she was receiving increasingly urgent radio calls from Bagram Air Base ordering her to return to base immediately. Viper. "Actual, I'm getting direct orders from Colonel Hayes to abort this mission and return to base," Mitchell reported, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "He's claiming that you've been compromised by enemy forces and that any aircraft remaining in the area will be considered hostile." The trap was closing with methodical precision. Hayes had the authority to order Mitchell's withdrawal, leaving the SEAL team completely isolated and defenseless against both the Taliban fighters and the American assassination squad. In a matter of minutes, 8 of America's most elite warriors would be eliminated by their own countrymen, and the conspiracy would be buried along with their bodies on the devil's backbone. But Morrison had one final card to play, a gambit so desperate and morally complex that it would either save his team or damn them all to hell. During his years in special operations, he had developed contacts within the intelligence community, men and women who operated in the gray areas between official policy and necessary action. One of those contacts was a CIA operative named David Cross, who had been investigating the same arms trafficking network that had led to their current predicament. Using Kim's jury-rigged communication system, Morrison bypassed normal military channels entirely and transmitted directly to Cross, on a frequency that existed in no official records. "Blackbird, this is Viper Actual. Requesting immediate intervention under Article 7 protocols. We have confirmation of Hayes' involvement in Operation Crimson Tide." The response came back within seconds, Cross's voice carrying the weight. "You have months of investigation and preparation. Viper Actual, authentication confirmed. Article 7 protocols are now in effect. Maintain your position for exactly 7 minutes, then execute Protocol Omega." Protocol Omega was a classified contingency plan that Morrison hoped he would never have to use. a scorched earth option that would expose the conspiracy to the highest levels of government, while simultaneously putting every member of his team on the permanent target list of some very dangerous people. But with their backs against the wall and their own military hunting them, it was their only chance for survival and justice. The next few minutes unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare. The American convoy approached the base of the ridge, their radios crackling with familiar voices calling out friendly greetings and casualty reports. Meanwhile, Mitchell continued to circle overhead, her A-10 serving as both guardian angel and potential executioner depending on which orders she chose to follow. Rodriguez, his machine gun trained on the approaching Americans, spoke what they were all thinking. Jesus Christ, Reaper, those are our guys down there. How did it come to this? The answer came not from Morrison, but from the sudden appearance of 3 black helicopters that materialized from the storm clouds like mechanical phantoms. These weren't military aircraft. They bore no markings, no identification numbers, just the sleek, predatory silhouettes of vehicles designed for operations that officially never happened. Cross's voice crackled over their comms with urgent instructions. Viper. Actual, those are my birds. When I give the word, you and your team are going to have exactly 90 seconds to reach the extraction point at grid November 77. After that, this entire area becomes a free fire zone. The extraction point was nearly 300 meters away, across terrain that was still covered by Taliban fighters and now threatened by the American hit squad. It would require every ounce of their training, courage, and brotherhood to make it alive. But more importantly, it would require them to trust completely in people they had never met, abandoning the military structure that had defined their entire adult lives. Patterson, despite his worsening wound, struggled to his feet with Doc Williams' help. "I'm not leaving anyone behind," he declared, chambering around in his automatic weapon despite the obvious pain the movement caused him. The final battle was unlike anything they had ever experienced. A 3-way firefight between Taliban insurgents, rogue American Special Operations soldiers, and a SEAL team fighting for their lives and their honor. Mitchell's A-10 provided cover with her remaining ammunition, while Cross's unmarked helicopters engaged both the Taliban and the American convoy with devastating effectiveness. As they fought their way across the broken ground of the Devil's Backbone, Morrison realized that they were no longer just 8 SEALs trying to survive. They had become the living embodiment of everything that was right about American military service, fighting against the corruption and betrayal that threatened to destroy the values they had sworn to protect. The extraction was chaos personified. Taliban fighters firing from concealed positions, American soldiers who had once been their brothers now hunting them with ruthless efficiency, and the constant threat of Mitchell's A-10 being forced to withdraw, leaving them completely exposed. Kim fell with a bullet through his thigh, but Chen and Rodriguez carried him forward, refusing to leave their communications specialist behind. In the final moments before reaching the extraction point, Morrison found himself face to face with the leader of the American hit squad, a man he recognized as Master Sergeant William Drake, a decorated Special Forces veteran who had served with distinction in 3 combat deployments. The recognition was mutual, and for a heartbeat both men hesitated, their weapons trained on each other across the rain-soaked stone of the mountain ridge. "It doesn't have to end this way, Jake," Drake called out, using Morrison's first name, in an attempt to personalize the moment. "Walk away from this. Take your team and disappear. Nobody has to know what happened here." Morrison's response was delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who had found his moral center in the midst of absolute chaos. "The only way this ends is with the truth, Bill. All of it." The gunfight lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it was over, Drake lay motionless on the Devil's Backbone, another casualty of a conspiracy that had consumed good men and turned them against everything they had once believed in. Morrison stood over the body of a man who had once been a hero, feeling the weight of a victory that tasted like ashes in his mouth. The helicopter extraction succeeded, but at a cost that would haunt Morrison for the rest of his life. As they lifted off from the cursed ridge, he could see Mitchell's A-10 finally breaking off its attack, the pilot having chosen loyalty to the truth over obedience to corrupt orders. Below them, the Devil's Backbone was littered with the bodies of American soldiers, Taliban fighters, and the dreams of men who had believed they were serving their country with honor. In the months that followed, the conspiracy was exposed. Colonel Hayes was court-martialed and sentenced to life imprisonment, and the arms trafficking network was dismantled. But the price of that victory was measured not just in lives lost, but in the fundamental trust that had been shattered between soldiers and their command, between patriots and their government, between idealism and the harsh reality of a world, where good men sometimes have to make terrible choices. Task Force Viper was officially disbanded, its members scattered to different units and sworn to secrecy about the events on the Devil's Backbone. But on quiet nights, when the weight of their experiences pressed down like the mountain mist, they would remember the ridge where 8 American SEALs learned that sometimes the greatest enemy isn't the one shooting at you from across a battlefield. Sometimes it's the one standing right beside you, wearing the same uniform and claiming to share the same cause. The Devil's Backbone had claimed its sacrifice, as it always did. But this time, the mountain had also witnessed something else, the triumph of honor over corruption, of truth over conspiracy, and of brotherhood over betrayal. In the end, that was a victory worth every terrible cost they had paid to achieve it.